So, yeah, we discussed about the concept of rights, what rights mean. Uh, we have looked at the idea of rights from both legal as well as moral dimensions. We also tried to break down this general idea of rights. He hopefully helps us in understanding rights. And he basically tells that legal relations could take many other forms than that of rights, okay, which we broadly interchangeably use as rights, but more appropriate words could also be used, and they refer to different kinds of legal relationships. So yeah, that's what we have covered so far. Today we are going to look at different kinds of legal rights. Okay, I'm not much concerned about moral rights, but as you will see, somehow those moral questions do overlap even when we discuss about legal rights here and there. But broadly, we are concerned about different kinds of legal rights. So the first category, the first kind are called perfect and imperfect rights. Perfect and imperfect rights. And what makes them perfect or imperfect rights? Now understand this, here we are no longer using the word rights in the same restricted sense as we used when we studied Hofel's jural analysis. But you will see that within these different kinds that we are going to discuss, you can apply all those categories as well. Okay. So anyway, the first category is that of perfect and imperfect rights. Okay. Now, what is a perfect right and what is an imperfect right? So a perfect right is correlated with a perfect duty. Okay, so a perfect right would be correlated with a perfect duty. So you see, we are using it in the first sense that Hoffel is using, because perfect right is correlated with a perfect duty. Okay, so Salman says a perfect right is one which corresponds to a perfect duty, what we just said. And a perfect duty is one which is not merely recognized by the law but enforced. Okay, so we are not to confuse, okay, ourselves. So when we make this distinction between perfect and more imperfect rights, we are not saying that imperfect rights do not exist. Okay, they exist. Okay, but the correlated duty is not a perfect duty, it is an imperfect duty. Okay, now what is an imperfect duty? So Salman tells us perfect duty is the one which is not merely recognized by law but also enforced. So an imperfect duty will be the one which is recognized by the law but not enforced. Okay, so it is the element of enforceability that determines if it is a perfect right or an imperfect right. So I hope this is understandable to you. So for example, and there could be many examples, okay, of perfect rights you understand. So if you were owed rupees 20 by someone, okay, that someone has to pay back the money, okay, to you. So that would be an example, okay, as long as you are owed to, okay, the money, okay, and it is also legally recognized as well as enforced, okay. So if the money is not paid, you can go to the court, okay. So then it will be enforced. So you can say that this is a case of perfect right, okay. Now, law of limitation imposes, okay, certain time period within which you have to institute a suit, okay, to realize the right, okay. So suppose a debt is owed to you, okay, and the debt was to be paid to you, but by certain time, but the debt is not paid back to you, okay. Now the law of limitation, as you will see when you study, okay, statutes of limitation, okay, you will see that it says that you are to institute a suit within a certain period of time. So 2 year, 3 year from the day that from the day when the money was to be paid to you. So whatever is the limitation period that is laid down, okay, If you do not institute the suit within that period and that period is over, after that, does the right exist? Yes, of course, the right exists. Okay, it is a right which is legally recognized. So duty is also legally recognized. The problem now is that you do not have a remedy, for enforcing the right anymore. Okay, so you do not have the remedy for enforcing the right anymore. So enforceability no longer exists. So the right exists, okay, but the duty also exists, but the duty is imperfect. Okay, it is recognized but not enforced. Okay, so those would be examples of perfect and imperfect rights. Okay, so a promissory note which is duly executed. Okay, when a promissory note is duly executed, okay, creates a perfect right, okay, in favor of the creditor, okay, and perfect duty in favor of the debtor, okay, and a perfect right entails that there is a remedy for violation, whereas in case of imperfect right, okay, that remedy of the remedy in case of violation does not exist. That's how we make this distinction. So it is a duty, okay, which a person, when we talk about imperfect duty, so it is a duty which a person is bound to perform as they are compelled by the law. Okay, so that's the idea. So a perfect right is not to be confused with just a moral right. Okay, a perfect right is not just a moral right. See, remember, we are talking about legal right now, so it is not merely an ought norm. Okay, it also comes with the protection, legal protection. So there are many things that we ought to do. Okay, but there is no legal compulsion for us to do. Whereas in case of legal right, okay, when it is a perfect right, okay, the law also compels performance of the duty. Okay, so paying one's debt, okay, is a duty, okay, and it is compelled by the law. Okay, one is compelled by the law to perform. Okay, so yes, the debtor has to pay the debt back to the creditor. Okay, however, we ought to feed the hungry. Okay, now this is something, unless it is legally enforced, unless there is a law that says that, well, the law says that you ought to, feed the poor. Now, unless that exists, this ought, okay, this duty which is imposed on you in itself does not amount to a perfect right. Okay, so it is not a perfect right. Okay, so perfect right is the one which is also enforceable by the law. Okay, so some rights could be moral right as well, and most moral rights could also be legal rights, and when they are legal rights, they have the protection of the law. However, the same right, okay, so in certain times, okay, if you sleep over your right, okay, if you're not vigilant enough, okay, and seek protection of the right from the law, and after the time period elapses, okay, after that the law does not provide you the protection, and then you can say that it is a case of imperfect right. So now what does that mean? So are moral rights also imperfect legal rights? Well, not necessarily. So some moral rights, okay, can be recognized as legal rights, so as long as they are recognized, they are legal rights. Now that legal right could be perfect as well as imperfect, and the criteria for distinction would be, as I just explained to you, that would be enforceability. Okay, so perfect rights are invariably recognized by law, and when it comes to moral rights, some may be, some others may not be. Okay, so the thing is that perfect right may become imperfect right. So as I gave you the example, okay, that a time-bound debt, okay, that debt, as long as it existed, okay, and you were within the period of time within which you were to institute a suit, okay, it was a perfect right. But once the law of limitation, okay, that time limitation period is over, after that the right exists, so you can use it as a defense, but no longer use it as a case of offense against the other party. Okay, so that means the right is still recognized, okay, but it's just not protected, okay, not enforceable under the law. Okay, so time but that, okay, is a good example of how a perfect right may become imperfect right. And the same is with the case of prescription, okay, which is based on this maxim known as uh, vigilantibus non dormantibus juris obveniens, that you are not supposed to sleep over your right. Okay, if you have a right, you have to be very careful, very vigilant. Okay, you have, so that's what it is based on. So what happens is that so if you own a land, okay, and then someone else uses and is in possession of the land, okay, openly, without any resistance from you whatsoever. It does not have to be physical resistance. So without any objection, okay, not in a hidden manner, but in an open manner, okay, for 13 years, okay, then the law of prescription after that period elapses, okay, you lose the right because it is no longer. But anyway, this is I think more apt example would be not this, okay, but the situations where easementary right may arise from prescription. So for example, someone has been using your land, okay, to go across your land for 20 years, okay, or more, without any intervention from you, without any objection from you. So after the 20 years of after the period of 20 years is over, that person now acquires prescriptive right. And what is that right? So the right in this case would be the right to go across the land. Okay, so right of way. Now you see that within those 20 years, it was a perfect right for you. Okay, that the other person does not interfere. Okay. But now after this, do you still have the right? Well, you do have the right, but law no longer protects, okay? Law no longer protects that right, okay? Why? The other person has, by prescription, acquired a specific right with respect to that property. So you see that within that period of time, you could have raised objection, and it would have been it was a perfect right. But after that period lapses, you no longer have that, right. I mean, it is there, but it is not protected anymore. So these are two examples of how a perfect right could become an imperfect right. So yeah, so imperfect rights are considered to be an exception to the maxim that we understand, that is ubi jus ibi remedium. So where there is a right, there is a remedy. So this is considered as an exception, okay, to that general maxim. Okay, so you have a right, it is recognized, but you do not have a remedy under the law. So it's considered as an exception to that general rule. That is, we just ibi remedium. Now, this distinction, okay, I was talking only from the perspective of legal right, okay. So now, perfect and imperfect rights, okay, this distinction also exists within the moral, within the domain of moral rights, okay. So within the domain of moral rights, okay, so the moral urgency of the rights determine whether you have a perfect duty or an imperfect duty. So especially in the works of Immanuel Kant and others, you will find. So, so the duty is imposed by the categorical imperatives, as Immanuel Kant talks about. Okay, those duties are perfect rights. Whereas there are other duties imposed by hypothetical imperatives. Those duties are something that you ought to do, but they are imperfect right, in the sense that the moral urgency is less compared to the perfect duties. So you ought not to lie, okay? You ought to respect human beings, okay? So those will be considered as perfect rights within the categorical imperatives, okay? And there could be other duties which are not categorical but based on the hypothetical imperative. and those would not so much be like, not be perfect rights but imperfect rights. But anyway, here we are concerned essentially with the idea of legal rights and how we distinguish this idea of perfect and imperfect rights within the idea of legal rights. So that's the first category of rights. So are you guys with me? Am I making sense?
Yes, sir.
What about the others? Okay. Okay, so the next kind of rights, next category of rights we are concerned about are the ones called positive rights and negative rights. Okay. Now, these two can be both like in both the legal domain as well as the moral domain. Okay, so legal rights can also be categorized into this as well as the moral rights. But you will see that here the legal moral quite often overlap, or our understanding of legal right is also colored by the moral urgency of those rights. Okay. Now, anyway, so how do we distinguish between positive and negative rights? Simple, as we discussed earlier. Okay, we have to then look at the duties. Okay, so what correlative duties exist there? So positive rights would entail positive duty, and negative rights would entail negative duty. Now, how do we distinguish between then positive duty and a negative duty? The distinction is simply this. Remember the content of the right. The content of the right includes a duty to do or a duty to abstain. Okay? So, duty to abstain requires inaction. Duty to do requires action. Okay? The action is positive in nature. It requires you to do something, so it's positive in nature. Whereas the inaction, okay, it requires you to abstain from doing something, okay, it requires you to refrain from doing something, so it's negative in its nature. And that's how, from the nature of the duties, we make this distinction of rights as well. So positive rights entail positive duty to do something, positive duty of action, and negative rights entail negative duties of abstaining, of inaction. So as simple as that. Okay, now let's take some example. Okay, so for example, Article 21 guarantees you right to life. Okay, now how do we understand this? Okay, I mean, what would be the meaning of right to life if we were to look at this right from both these different perspectives? Okay, so let's say that right to life is negative right. Okay, what would that mean? Well, you have a right and others have a duty with respect to your right. Now, if it is a negative right, others ought to abstain from doing something. So others ought to avoid taking away your life. Okay, others ought to refrain from taking away, doing anything that would amount to taking your life. So I hope you understood. Okay, so when we understand right to life from a negative perspective, okay, so others are prohibited from doing something, okay, that will negate my life, okay, that will take away my life. Okay, so you ought not to murder me, you ought not to kill me, and legally as well you can say that. Okay, so you are not to kill me. Okay, your duty is not to kill or murder me. So what you are required to do in the way that I was trying to explain is to not do something. Okay, so when we talk about right to life in the context of the state, in the negative sense, this is the thing. Okay, that the state ought not to take away your life. Okay, now I'm not talking about whether the right is absolute or not. That's a different question altogether. Okay, so and in different judgments as well, the moral question inevitably arises, but I'm not going to get drawn into all those questions. Okay, so what does Article 21 say? It talks about protection of life and personal liberty. I'm concerned about life here. So it says, no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. Now you have this entire debate on this, whether it's a positivistic definition or whether it's a kind of naturalistic definition. What do I mean by that? That if there is a procedure established by law and it allows the state to arbitrarily take away life, would that be okay? Some would say yes. It is not really arbitrary, because why? Because the law has been laid down, and then it says that, well, if you follow the requirements of the law and then your life is taken away, no problem with that. Whereas there is a natural law-based definition that would say that, well, even if there is a procedure, the procedure cannot be unjust. Okay. So anyway, I'm not talking about all that for now. Okay, that's a separate debate altogether. I'm concerned about what does it mean to say that I have a right to life, as has been mentioned in this particular article. So it says protection of life, okay, and personal liberty, that no person shall be deprived of his life. So it's said to be deprived, okay. So deprived how? It requires inaction, okay. So it requires that the state doesn't do anything, okay, that amounts to taking away your life. That's one way of understanding right to life, that state does not take away your right. But you know that right to life is not just that, okay. Right to life is not just that. There is a positive element to the right to life as well, okay. So what does positive right say? The positive right says that there is a positive duty. And what does positive duty require? It requires that something is done, okay, not merely inaction. So when we look at the right to life from that perspective, from the positive rights perspective, it means that the state is required to do certain things in order to protect your right. So it's not merely abstaining from taking away your life. It also requires that your life is protected. Okay, so preserved. Okay, so preservation of life is also important. Now the debate quite often arises as to what is required to be done in order to protect. Okay, so if I'm hungry, then the state needs to give me food. So my right to life requires that the state gives me basic food. Okay, now when I'm using the word basic, well, there's a problem. So but that will take entire semester to discuss about. But anyway, for now, just understand. Said that, well, for you to survive, for you to exist, you need certain basic minimum. Okay, so many say that, well, states have a duty to provide you food. Well, right to life also means dignified existence. Okay, so dignified existence would mean that I'm not allowed to sleep on the I'm not compelled, okay, by necessities to sleep on the street. So I might also have a right to a shelter, right to livelihood. You can just go on, okay, about it. So right to life would mean dignified life, okay. So if I fall sick, okay, it affects my life, okay. So that would also mean that state needs to protect my life, okay. So mere inaction would not suffice. State has to do something. So state has to make basic healthcare facilities and others available to me. So it would require the state to do something in order to protect and preserve my right. Okay. So if you understand right to life from that perspective, you will see that that's the positive rights. Okay. Now I gave you this example of one right, that is right to life, to tell you that the same right could have both the elements. Okay, both negative as well as positive elements. Now why did I start with this example? So what happened is that this categorization, okay, of rights into positive and negative rights conceptually is not very problematic. Okay, it helps us understand what the correlative duty is. What is the other party required to do or not do? So it helps us with that. Okay, but then the problem arises when rights, okay, human rights as we understand, okay, are also categorized into different kinds based on this concept. Okay, so we usually say that the negative rights broadly overlap with the civil and political rights. Okay, the civil and political rights, whereas your positive rights, okay, Well, they could be some civil and political rights, okay, but mostly economic, social, and cultural rights, okay. Now, why do we have this distinction? Well, it has arisen so based on some ideological battle that was going on during the Cold War era, okay. Now, but today we have a different understanding. Today we have this understanding that human rights cannot be categorized into generations, okay. Then you have the third generation. So you say that civil political rights are first generation, your socioeconomic rights are second generation, and then you have these other rights like environmental rights, etc., as considered as third generation rights. But our understanding today is that we cannot really differentiate. I mean, we can differentiate them. I mean, human rights will be futile if we completely separate them. So your civil political rights will not really mean much if your other rights, so your socio-economic rights, are also not protected, okay. But you see that this distinction has arisen from this understanding of right. So why is that? So you know that the United States, okay, was essentially based on this idea of liberty, okay, of choice, of freedom. So that means no paternalistic interference is allowed on the part of the state, okay. So they would say they focus more on this idea of free market, and etc., etc. So you get my point, what I'm referring to, okay. They're focusing more on the element of liberty. On the other hand, you had the Soviet bloc that focused more on equality. So they believed in paternalistic state interference, especially in distribution of resources, properties, etc. Okay, so they would not respect liberty to the same extent. Okay, now when I'm talking about liberty, I'm referring to something very specific here. So I'm referring to property here. The implication is with respect to property. So you'll see that in the United States, the right to private property is given much more protection, okay, then it will receive in the Soviet bloc, okay. So they want to create an equal society. So liberty would inevitably lead to inequality. So when we try to bring about equality, liberty has to be sacrificed. So that's the idea, that civil political rights are essentially about liberty, okay, your choice to do something or not to do something, and states' businesses to keep its hands off my liberties, okay, my property. And whereas on the other hand, you have the socio-economic right that says that requires that everyone has certain basic, certain entitlements. That would require that some kind of distributive interference on the part of the state. Now, because of this ideological difference, we had Universal Declaration of Human Rights, okay, but that was not sufficient. We later had these two separate covenants on human rights. So you have ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then you also had ICSCR, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Okay, now you will see that some civil political rights are, even if we deny this distinction, okay, you will see that some civil political rights are definitely positive rights, okay, that require. So, for example, forget about food and education, shelter, etc. Those are clearly socioeconomic rights, okay. But even these so-called civil political rights, for example, my liberty, my freedom, etc., won't really mean much if there is no system put in place to protect my liberties. Okay, so you have, for example, the police out there, okay, and you have this court, okay, that helps you, okay. So you see that this judicial system and other administrative mechanism which has been put in place, okay, they require that resources are, expended, okay. So that requires that the state does something, and that when the state does not expend well, then your rights and liberties do not really mean much. So you see that even civil political rights, okay, could also clearly have certain positive elements, okay. Now, this is the distinction. So you see that when it comes to civil political rights, okay, we broadly say that, well, those are my right to life, my different freedoms, okay, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So all those would be categorized as, civil and political rights, okay. Even your property, etc., okay, are civil and political rights. And then we have socio-economic rights. And what are those? If you're talking in terms of, right to food, shelter, housing, education, healthcare, etc., okay, anything that requires state to distribute resources, then you can say that those are cases of socio-economic rights, okay. Now, that's how the concepts differentiate rights into different categories. But many disagree. Okay, many disagree that, well, we can probably conceptually categorize, but in reality, okay, when it comes to how it actually works out in our real life, okay, see, the poor people, okay, the poor, marginalized, disenfranchised people do not really enjoy even their civil political rights, okay, so-called liberty-based rights, okay. So liberty means what? I need to be able to exercise choice, okay. I need to have autonomy. So if I do not have food in my tummy, if I do not have the basic education, how do I exercise choice, okay? This so-called meritocratic society in which everyone is expected to compete with each other, okay, that's the essence of capitalism, where everyone's ought to compete with each other. We are concerned about efficiency. How do you expect someone who doesn't have basic necessities guaranteed to them, okay, assured to them, to compete with someone, okay, who has everything? It just does not make sense. So they do not get to exercise the same choices. They do not have the same autonomy, even though we maintain this facade of, choice, autonomy here. It does not really exist in reality. So why am I talking about this? I'm merely telling you that your liberties does not really exist, okay. Your choices, your freedom, they don't really exist if you do not have the capacity to make those choices, okay. So some philosophers talk in terms of capability approach, okay. They say that, well, people are able to exercise choices, people are able to exercise freedom only when they are capacitated, when they have the capability of making those choices. They need not be compelled to do something or the other, no, but they need to have the capability of doing this or that, okay. So that has to be there, okay. So why am I referring to all this? I'm just merely telling you that, well, conceptually categorizing rights into negative, positive rights and cool and fun makes sense, tells us what specific duties require, okay. But when we go beyond that, you see that they are overlapping. In real life, they are overlapping. So someone in very poor health, okay, they will not be able to, have the resources. They will be economically worse, okay. And someone who's economically worse will have much higher likelihood of, falling into poverty. So you can say that, well, people need to exercise choices, but someone who's bedridden because of disease, poor health, or hunger will not really be able to exercise those choices. And if I do not have choices, where is my liberty then? So I'm really repeating this to drum this in your head, that conceptually you can make this distinction, but in reality, well, it's quite different. Now let me also substantiate, okay, my point in a different way. You see that some of the countries which are completely based on this idea of merely liberty, even though these countries might have very high, growth rate, okay, big economies, you will see that they're not performing as well as compared to certain others in terms of human development, okay, or in terms of many other factors, okay, health, performance in health, happiness, many indicators could be looked at, and then you see that those countries which are purely based on this idea of protection of private property and talking in terms of merely liberty, okay, at the cost of other factors, see that there are inequalities in those societies. And in those societies, there is also higher likelihood of crimes happening, and there'll be more resources they need to put in, policing the people. Okay, so they spend the resources, but to physically contain violence, etc. Okay, but those countries, okay, and the same, okay, at the same time, not emphasizing too much on equality. Okay, equality is obviously very important. At the same time, not at the cost of not at the cost of completely like getting rid of liberty. You also need people to exercise their liberty, and if people do not have choices, then that life is also worthless. Okay, you don't really feel like being an individual if all your choices are made by someone else. You don't want that either. Now you can say that, well, maybe that's my ideological position. Obviously it is, but I'm telling you of certain good examples that we have where both are respected. So if you look at some of the Nordic countries, okay, they also have high taxes. So for example, Canada has high taxes, okay, or Nordic countries have high taxes. But if you look at them, they also have higher human development, okay. They have approximate equality in their society. They have better healthcare. They have good, educational system. They have fewer crimes, so you do not need as much resources, used for law and order, okay, because people do not really feel the necessity of committing serious crimes, etc. Okay, so and then you also see, health, see them performing better in terms of healthcare. So in those societies, you will see that they have public healthcare system. They have better insurance systems, even when it is paid by everyone, or if someone is vulnerable, it is paid for by the state. You will see that in those societies, certain mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that no one falls below certain threshold. Okay, there's a safety net for everyone. Okay, bad times come for all of us. Okay, so in those bad times, we do not need to be on the streets, fending for our own selves. The rest have to come to the rescue of others. At the same time, we do not create a completely uniform society where there is no varieties, there is no choices, there are no differences. Not like that, but some basic minimum is guaranteed in those countries, and you see those countries are also performing well. So why I'm telling you about all this is that, well, complete emphasis on one set of right at the cost of the other also does not help us. Okay, so negative and positive rights may be very important for us, but categorizing human rights into different categories and then preferring one over the other also does not help us. Okay, so criticism of this sort has also been developed by one philosopher by the name Henry Shue, and I had already mentioned him in our previous jurisprudence classes. Okay, so anyway, the idea for Henry Shue is the same, that these so-called rights that we call as negative rights, okay, also require certain positive duties to do something, not merely negative duties of abstaining. So I gave you an example of right to life, okay, that requires not merely state's abstinence, okay, but also action to do something, okay. And these so-called socio-economic rights, which are considered as civil and political rights, quite often also require state inaction rather than action, okay. So what could those be? So for example, states should not make policies, okay, that take away certain basic guarantees people already had, okay. So it should not go for complete privatization of everything, okay, that takes away certain entitlement that people already had, okay. So you will see that, okay, so I'm not going into detailed analysis of his work. I will share the reading. You guys kindly go ahead with that, okay. So he talks about rights, in terms of, that which protects you against certain standard threats, okay. So what are those threats? Okay, so the threats could be in terms of your security. Obviously, your life means nothing if there is no security of life, okay. And also, once you have a so-called life with security, that is also not enough if you do not have basic subsistence. Okay, the basic subsistence is also required. Okay, and above that, well, let the people have choices. Okay, but below that, that needs to be protected and paid for by the state. Okay, so it says that rights are essentially to ensure that you have security as well as subsistence. Okay, so these are the standard threats against which rights provide you protection. Okay, so yeah, so that's essentially what this idea of rights all about. Okay, so I will not go beyond this because this might only get you confused, but I will share some reading that you guys can read and then reflect over. So in the next class, we are going to discuss about the other kinds of rights. So that's it for today. Now I'm going to allot project topics.